and welcome to this After Effects tutorial from Very Good Studios. My name is Matthew Hemming, and today's tutorial topic is using Element3D and Particular to fell a tree in After Effects. Alright, let's get on with the tooting. Here we have our original image as provided by the client. It was probably a reasonably nice photograph before being crushed into 8-bit color. My partner in crime, David O'Brien, has already added a looping background of clouds to give the image a little bit of life, because it will have to be up on screen for the duration of a fairly long presentation. Now in this particular section, we want this path on the right to be blocked by a tree falling across of it. And this represents some sort of obstacle in their industry, so that this gentleman presenting it perhaps suggest how his team may strategically respond. My suggestion is chainsaws. As you can see in this image, there isn't a tree that lends itself to easy extraction, which is why we are going to use a 3D tree brought in with Element3D. If you don't know, Element3D is plugin software from compositing legend Andrew Kramer over at Video Copilot. Arguably the most useful extension of an Adobe product ever, Element allows the animation, manipulation, and rendering of 3D objects directly within After Effects. If you don't own this software, go buy it now. It is very reasonably priced. If you have pirated this delightful and affordable software, you are a bad person and you should feel bad inside. Our first step is to create a new solid. I'm going to call it Elemental Tree. I will then apply the Video Copilot Element plugin and jump directly to Scene Setup. In the Models browser, I am going to choose my pine tree. Trees are not hard to find. They are quite abundant and grow throughout the world wide web, and can be found on popular geometry websites like TurboSquid. This particular model actually comes from an iPad app called Tree Sketch, a wonderful piece of abandonware from the University of Calgary. However, we do have this pine tree, which was modeled and exported by Chris Friesen and made available on the web, so we'll use it here today. Here it is. It's come in by default on Group 1. Let's click OK. The tree now appears in our scene. Using Group 1 and the replicator controls, let's move it into position. Almost right. And then I'd like to adjust in the particle look its scale to fit in with the rest of the scene. Now, hats off to Stephen Longuet. We can see here that the anchor point by default has come in right at the bottom of the tree, which means we can scale it and not have to reposition it every time that we change size. Now, if this was not the case, we do have the option in Element of changing the anchor point to a series of presets, the top of the tree, the right, the back, the bottom, which is good, or adjusting it manually. This will also adjust the center of rotation and the geometric center for any deform effects that we apply to the tree. Before we begin animation, it behooves us to blend this tree into the image a little bit. So let's begin Element3D on our output. Let's crank up the super sampling. Now, super sampling renders the image in memory at a much higher dimension and then scales it down to blend the edges and give us this nice anti-alias look. Now, the next thing we need to do is add some lighting. We can see from the shadows on the other trees that our light here is off to the left and upward. Let's create our own light. I will call it the sun. It is a spotlight. I've colored it yellow to match with the very yellow foreground here, and I've cranked the intensity up to 400% in order to match the sort of a crushed 8-bit color look of our original image. And very importantly here, we've activated Casts Shadows. This information will be needed by the Element3D plugin in order to cast its own shadows. Our light appears in the scene, pointed nowhere in particular. I'm going to take the point of interest and put it on our tree. The light has to be now positioned approximately where we think the sun might be. Our light is in position and we need to activate shadowing within the Element plugin. The first shadowing we're going to apply is ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is a kind of cheat. It's a little bit subtle on this image, but what it does is whenever geometry is near other geometry, it creates a bit of shade on it. But we also want to use proper shadows. Going to use shadow mapping for this, ray tracing slower, not really necessary, and we can see now that the shadows are starting to fall in a way that is reasonable. If we move our sun around, of course these shadows will move. But I think I've got them in a decent position now. It's very, very dark in the shadows. It's too dark. We can see in the real image that there's a little bit of blue that is lighting up these shadows. So let's go into the internal lighting. I'm going to select clean blue as my preset. So I'm going to rotate it so that it's approximately lined up with the sources of intensity in the image. And I will take the brightness multiplier down to 10%. See, it's just a little bit of a fill, especially on the leaves, which are, after all, translucent. Still a bit sharp and intense, though, especially if we zoom in a little bit. You can see how this tree looks a little crunchy and a little bright. Take the saturation down about 44%. I think that's better. And then just to take the edge off those leaves, I'm going to apply a simple fast blur. 0.2 pixels. Better. It looks like it belongs in this scene and is not drawing undue attention to itself. I'm going to isolate the tree layer here so that it's easier to see. I've also reduced the quality to draft in order to make the interface more responsive while we're doing motion. Obviously, this is not a concern if you are on a brand spanking new Mac Pro. However, I am using an aging model from Dickety 012. The first thing we are going to do is caret down group 1 of the element scene interface and the particle replicator controls. And we're looking particularly here at replicator rotation. Just about near 1 second, I'm going to put a keyframe for Z rotation. This is the tree upright. Pressing U to reveal animated properties, we can see the single keyframe on the Z. Now, ultimately, we want our tree down. I'm going to say 2 seconds later. We are going to rotate -93. And we can even take a quick RAM preview to see what this looks like. Timber. You'll note here how the tree is pivoting at the center of rotation. If we had changed that to the top, our tree would be doing this. When you're rotating objects, it's important where you're pivoting them from. In this case, to pivot from the bottom. We need a little bounce on this tree. Here it comes down and just sort of squarely lands there. I'm going to ease it out to begin with so that the tree starts gradually. I don't know what's causing this tree to fall. I assume it's market conditions or something like that. So, but we're going to give it a little bit of an ease in. I'm going to replicate this later keyframe. And then in between these, at about, say, 2:15, we're going to have just a little bit of kickback. Now, we can modify the interpolation of these keyframes to make that a little more credible. I like to change these into one of these little round jobs. I'm sure it's got a very complex name. You can look it up in some tedious Adobe video if you're interested. I just like what it does to the motion graph. I think I'm going to make this an ease on both sides, an easy ease. So it's both easing in and easing out. It's sort of a moment of pause before it jumps back up, and then finally ease in for our settle. That's a little bit more believable. We've got a bit of bounce to it, but as you can see, there are a number of problems immediately apparent. And certainly one of them is we're not casting shadows and that we're kind of going through the ground, which is not very, very credible. Let's go into our element scene setup and let's create a plane 4x4. I'm actually going to subdivide it a little bit because we are going to add a deformation later. So you can see we can up the amount of facets so that we get nice smooth curves. We now have a shadow catching plane beneath our tree. Now, because I want to orient this along the path, it doesn't look quite right to me. I'm going to just give it a little bit of an altered orientation. And here we go, matching the hill on the side. So our shadows are behaving correctly, but our plane is currently attached to our tree. Drag the plane model out of group 1. Let's put it on group 2. So our shadow catcher is doing basically what it should. Let's give it the appropriate texture so it starts behaving as a shadow catcher. Here in Materials, Physical Shaders, Matte Shadow, which I will now drag onto the plane model, which appears to basically disappear, except for the shadow. Now we can see that the shadow is moving as the tree falls, stays aligned with the trail. However, I'm having a problem over here, where the shadow remains straight, even though we can see the land clearly dips down. We're going to add a deformation right here. Noise is the one we would like. We can put a bit of noise on there. Now I'm actually going to make our plane, I'm going to give it a different texture so that we can just see it temporarily more easily. How about bright red paint? That's pretty easy to see. And we want to add a little bit of irregularity. Once again, going to replace it with the shadow catching texture. Now we can see our shadow is doing something much more interesting. The trail looks like it's irregular with a rise in the middle and dropping off on either side. Now our tree is getting eaten by the shadow catching plane. It's not visible on the other side, which is good, except we will have to do something with where are these pine needles going. But first, this. What we'd like to do is try to suggest that this has harder parts and softer parts that are reacting to this motion a little bit differently. So, group 1, particle look, deform. Let's add a bend. Now, bending will bend the tree in all sorts of wonderful ways. The way we would like to bend it is along the y-axis, which allows us to bend it back and forth like so. As our fall gets going, I want the top, the softer part of the tree, to be trailing behind a little bit. So I will advance in the animation to 206 and put in a nice 10-degree bend. At 3 seconds, this bend will have gone back to 0. A little trailing the bounce back, because motion takes a minute to transmit through an object, is I'm going to flip the bend -5. I'm going to make all these a bunch of easy easers. And now we can see there's a little bit of motion transmitted through the tree. As it comes down, the motion decays and dissipates through the softer parts. At least that's the suggestion when there's a little bit of wiggle after the final fall. Now that is a nicely falling tree, but it is falling in front of these foreground objects. That's what we'll take care of next. These foreground objects differ from the rest of the scene primarily in their values. Because the sun is ahead of them, they are primarily being lit with these darks and medium values, whereas the background is this lighter green and white of the stones. So I think the way to extract this is by adjusting the values. I'm going to duplicate my world layer, world foreground. I'm going to apply extract, because the idea here is I want to extract the lighter points of the image. So I'm going to bring this way down so that mostly what we have here are just the foreground parts. Now we have to mask out the rest of this garbage. So I will temporarily turn off my extraction and do some good old-fashioned rotoscoping. That's where we use the mask tool to highlight just the areas of the image that we want to see. Rotoscoping, rotoscoping, a little more rotoscoping in here. And there, clickety-click, we have a complete mask that is isolating the foreground area. And by reapplying our extract filter, we take away the highlights, and what remains is simply the foreground. Now we will add some of my favorite things, some particles, to simulate needles coming off the tree as it falls. I'm going to call this Particular Leaving Leaves. I will be using Trapcode Particular, which is distributed by the fine people at Red Giant Software. So our particle system releases lots of little animated bits with rules or behaviors which dictate how they tend to behave without specifying actual animated positions for each particle. Let's put the generator for the particles, the emitter, right here on our tree. Particles per second up to 1600. The kind of emitter is going to be a sphere, so the particles will emit from an area rather than a point. And that area I would like to be tall, like the tree. I'm going to give these particles a very low velocity because I don't want them to have much energy of their own. They're more or less being left behind as the tree moves forward. Direction, outward. This is a short-lived particle. We really just sort of want to see them trailing behind the tree and then vanishing, so just 1.5 seconds. My particle type, I'm going to use a streaklet, which is a sort of irregular little shape. I'm going to leave their size at 5 for the time being so we can see them more easily. Ultimately, we're going to take those down to 2. I'm also going to take the size random percentage up to 100%. Finally, the size over life. This is a graph that controls size over life. I want a rather sharp attack and a slow decay. And I'll smooth that out. I always set my color random about 15% to give a little bit of natural variation. Again, I'm going to leave them white just for the time being. We'll turn them green like the needles ultimately. I am going to put on a shadowlet for main. This is like the ambient occlusion shading in Element. It's a bit of a cheat. When one facet is near another facet, it will create a sort of dark multiply halo, a simulated shadow, which I'd like to be 20% opacity. Physics. We're going to use an air model with some gravity 98. A little bit of air resistance, as these are tiny needles. So right now we have this sort of continuous cascade of sparkles. As the tree is sweeping through the air, it's causing turbulence. So what we'd like to do is take the spin amplitude up to 45. This is a lot like the rotation pivot point in the models we were using earlier. It means that the particles are rotating around a point which is 45 points, 45 pixels, 45 magic particular units away from the center. The very beginning of our animation is, of course, locked on the tree, and at the very beginning is emitting no particles. As our tree is moving along, our particle count again comes down to 0, and in the middle, doing our full 1600 particles per second. We put an ease in on that. So now our particles rapidly peak and then stop emitting. We still have to animate our emitter, not just the amount, but its actual position, in order to move with the falling tree. So I'm going to go forward, and now move my emitter to where the tree has fallen. Ease out on the position. Not bad. I'd still like our leaves to be following the tree a little bit, getting sucked along by the wind. Back in our physics area, I'm going to add a slight -5 wind. So we've now added a little bit of wind to the -x to draw the particles along with the tree. -x is a terrible way to refer to the left. If anyone ever asks you for directions to the post office, never tell them to proceed along the x-axis. Give it a nice dark green color. Size reduce to 2. So we've added another subtlety here of these needles coming off the tree as it comes down. Now, to address this section here, this shredding of needles that is happening as they encounter the ground, I'm going to duplicate my particular instance. I'm turning the layer green because needles are green and it helps me visually keep my composition organized. Particular road leaves 1, because we're going to make 2. And go to the plugin settings. We're going to modify them a little bit from what we had for the first particle system. We are going to change the size of our sphere here to 100 magical units in all directions, and place my emitter here, where the shredding is happening. I'm also going to bring up the velocity to 50. I'm going to have them start just as we make contact here. A sharp attack, so that as soon as the needles hit the ground, they start to distribute. So they're sort of shredding randomly here, not really doing what we want because we need them to react against the ground. So, like creating the shadow catcher for Element, we need a bounce layer for these particles to treat as the trail surface. My bounce layer, I'm going to make it 3D. I'm going to rotate it. And I'm going to give it a little bit of Y rotation just to match the hill that we have here. Great. And then move it down into position so that it is roughly approximating the ground. Now we can turn this layer off because the only layer that needs to see it is particular. We go into the physics settings. Instead of using an air model, we will now use a bounce model. We will specify that our floor layer is bounce layer. The collision event we will specify as stick. My particle itself, I'm going to give a longer life, and for its size over life, I'm going to have it plateau a little bit longer before starting its decay. So now as our tree falls, we have a second area of needles accumulating on the ground. I don't think there's quite enough for me here. I will duplicate my road leaves. I'll call these road leaves 2. I'm going to put these ones behind our tree. I think there should be more particles. How about 2400 instead of 1600? Give a random seed to the emitter so that it's a slightly different spread of particles. Change my size a little bit so it's a slightly different footprint. So there we have a nice secondary accumulation of particles on the bounce plane as our tree goes down. Now we have dealt with the large tree coming down, our medium-sized particles falling away and becoming shredded, and finally it's time for our microscopic layer. That is our dust and debris that is kicked up by this violent tree falling. So I'm going to use for my dust a piece of stock footage from the Video Copilot Collection Action Essentials 2. These are a series of visual effects elements on Alpha Channel in high definition. I'm going to be using Smoke Charge 4 today, which I'm going to drag to After Effects. Because my frame rate in this project is 2997, I will conform the frame rate to 2997 so that everything is working at the same frame rate together. So here's our smoke charge layer isolated. The first thing I'm going to do is apply a round mask in order to be sure that we're not getting a hard edge at the bottom of this effect. And I'm going to feather that mask so it's a nice soft edge. I'm going to position the smoke charge so that it comes from approximately the right place. I'm going to reduce the scale, slight rotation to have it pushing away from the impact. I'm going to tint the smoke to a more dusty color here. I am going to have the smoke get to 50% opacity at maximum. Start off at 0, but to easy ease into that 50%. Not bad. I'm going to duplicate this, create another instance, which I'm going to put behind the tree. I'm going to flip its x-axis so it's a little bit different. Set it off a little later. And now we have sort of two layers of dust coming up from the path and the grass, I guess, as this tree impacts the ground. And finally, here is our completed animation. The tree is integrated in terms of lighting. It's casting shadows in the real environment. It's dropping needles, and they are landing in the environment, and it's giving a dust response to show that it's really shaken this world up, and it's happening behind this foreground element. That's it from me today. Thanks are due to our sponsor, Relay Event Management, purveyors of premier, award, corporate, and sports events. As well as the good people at Momentium, who hired us to take care of the presentation this tree sequence actually comes from. And thank you for bearing with me through this, my very first instructional video. I am Matthew Hemming, tutoring this tutorial for Very Good Studios.